welcome everybody. It's lovely to see lots of people here, both from within Travers Smith and from outside. And this is one of the sessions for LGBT plus History Month. Its genesis was a discussion amongst members of the LGBT plus group within Travers about the kind of events that we would find interesting. And we thought that we do a lot in the business with young LGBT people through Just Like Us and other charities. We do also do quite a lot in the business with older people, but we haven't ever really done anything which looks at that intersection of age and LGBT, looking at it on a specifically multi-generational basis. So we thought it would be great to try and involve both Just Like Us and the charity ODL, which you will hear a lot more about from people who know a lot more about it than me shortly. But I can tell you that it is a fantastic charity. One of my good friends has been on the board for a long time and speaks about it with enormous passion, and I have learned a lot in the last few days preparing for this session with the panelists about just what a great charity it is. And Just Like Us will be familiar to lots of people, as well as it being a charity partner. I also chair the board of trustees of Just Like Us, and as people will be aware, the firm has done a lot of things with JLU over the years, from providing legal advice, which we do on a near day-to-day basis about one thing or another, to co-running the mentoring scheme with them, which is now in its 4th year, and is a really great way of not just the mentees getting stuff out of it, but also all the mentors learning from their mentees as well. So what are we going to do here? Well, basically, shortly I'm going to hand over to our panel. It's an excellent panel. I've had a lot of fun, as well as learning a lot. I've had a lot of fun in the last few days, chatting with everybody on the panel and learning more about their own histories. This is LGBT History Month, after all, and they're varied and interesting. And I think people are going to find this panel a really uplifting event as well, as being something which will hopefully we'll learn from and potentially help us to sort of expand our horizons. We are going to allow some time for questions. So the format will be that the panelists are going to introduce themselves shortly. Then I will ask them to share their thoughts on a few points which we've discussed in advance, and then we'll allow some time for questions from people around the virtual room. So if you've got a question, put your hand up at the appropriate time, or if you have got a question as we go along that you'd like us to deal with, probably at that point as well, then put it in the chat box, either to everyone or just to me. If you feel more comfortable it not being attributed to you, then just put it to me and I'll field it. Yeah, I'm hoping that people have lots of questions or comments as we go through. We will aim to wrap up by 1:30. And just, I think this has been mentioned already, but this is being recorded. The intention is to put a version of this onto our YouTube channel. And so if you're asking questions or contributing, then just please be aware of that. So I'm going to hand over to the panel, and just looking at my screen, I'm going to ask Annie, then Jeffrey, then Millie, then Richard to introduce themselves in turn, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Hi, everybody. I think I'm going first here. Can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
You can. Cool. Okay. Okay. Well, great. And thank you very, very much for inviting us from ODL along today. We're thrilled to be able to join Millie and talk about intergenerational issues around the LGBTQ plus communities. I am a trustee of Opening Doors London and I'm ambassador. I've spend a lot of my time coming around and talking to people to spread the word and help people to understand the issues facing the older LGBT communities. I'm 70, I'm a lesbian. My working background was mainly mental health in the NHS and then fostering children. And then my sort of last paid job before retiring was managing the services for the Albert Kennedy Trust. So this is great for me because, you know, I was very much involved in younger LGBTQ plus people's worlds. And now I've gone to the other end of the spectrum, which is sort of partly to sort of protect my own future. My personal history is that I came out when I was married to a man in my 30s. I had a young child at the time. And for some reason, which was never quite clear to me at the time, was that what catapulted me into it was doing the Terence Higgins Trust HIV/AIDS counselling course in the 80s, where I met a very charismatic woman who I fell in love with, and that was it, really. I couldn't look back because I had to come out to my then husband, and everything went extremely difficult at that time. And I'm one of the women who have had to go to court for custody of children and had to face to all that. That was a very traumatic time for me. I moved to London from the Lake District, and my career took off, which I think often happens when we are allowed to be ourselves and start to be part of the community that we really feel comfortable with. A few pretty dreadful years personally in terms of the family. Eventually my daughter did come to live with me, although she had a few years being looked after by her husband, by my then husband. But then, you know, everything really came together for me, even though that relationship split up. I then found my partner, who I've now been with for 25 years, and we live in London. My daughter also lives in London. She came out as a lesbian in her late teens as well, and is civil partnered and has 2 children. So it's a very LGBTQ plus family, and a very happy one, it has to be said. I can't think of a better way to spend my my time as a retired person than doing a bit of campaigning for our communities and spreading the word. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Annie. It's so good to have you on this panel. Jeffrey.
Right. Okay. My name is Jeff. I'm a member of the BAME LGBT community. I have spent most or my entire working life in healthcare. I took early retirement at the end of 2010 because I got to the top of the profession that I had chosen. I started out initially as a nurse, working in various areas of nursing, but then I decided I wanted a change. So I went back and I trained as a cardiac physiologist, and I managed a very busy department for 27 years as head of that unit. And I reached a point where I thought, well, I've done enough, long enough, worked hard enough. It was now time to take time out for myself, which I did. I can't give a coming out story because I've never really been in. So I can't say to anyone I came out on this particular date or this was my big coming out story. I have always just carried on as what people would say a normal person. I have just do what I wanted to do and say, to hell with what people think. This is me. And I'm going to enjoy life. I met my partner in my previous partner, unfortunately, he passed away in 2012 from cancer, 2011 from cancer. But we met at a very famous club in Earl's Court, the Catacombs. Richard might know that. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And this was a very, very strange story because I had seen him 2 years previously at another club. I saw him across the floor and I fell in love with him immediately. I had never seen him in my entire life. I had no idea who he was, but I kept this mental picture in my head of this very nice guy. And 2 years later, I went to a club and someone approached me, and it turned out to be that guy. And we were together for almost 36 years until he passed away. But it's 36 wonderful years, absolutely no regrets whatsoever. We had some fantastic times. And I joined ODL because, as I said, I'm an ambassador to ODL, and I've done some training on the health side with their training manager, Jim Glennon. And my reason for doing that is because I had spent so many years from the ages of 19 up to the age of 63 in healthcare. I felt my background would have placed me ideally to go in that area, which I did. And I have learned quite a bit in going around various places with Jim and other ambassadors on the healthcare training side. And it's something that I'm looking forward to doing again when we can do that. So that's a little bit about me.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. What a lovely story. Millie.
Yeah, hiya. My name's Millie. So I work as a social prescribing link worker in Bristol, but I also volunteer for Just Like Us. I volunteered there since November 2019. And they're kind of a charity that recruit young LGBT plus people. So it's kind of run by young LGBT plus people for young LGBT plus people. And the main thing that we do is kind of go into schools and we provide that positive representation, and we kind of tell our stories, and we aim to kind of educate people not only who are part of the community but also cisgender and heterosexual people. And yeah, it's been an absolutely amazing experience. And there's kind of other bits that we do as well. We kind of have opportunities to write articles, like I've written some articles for the Gay Times and things like that, which is really cool. And they also do things like podcasts, and they have, like Daniel was mentioning, they have the mentoring program and things like that. And then events like this, which are really amazing too. Yeah, and then in terms of my coming out story, I came out initially when I was 17. I kind of piggybacked off my younger brother, who came out as gay as well, so I identify as a gay woman. And he told my parents, and then they told me, and I was like, oh, got a bit of a surprise. Me too. So that was a bit of a surprise for them, but yeah, I was really lucky to have lots of support from them. So yeah, that's me. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here today, so thank you.
Thank you, Millie. I'm sure your parents appreciated that Noah's Ark approach to coming out.
Yeah.
Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard, and thank you for inviting us. I was 21 when I came out. It was the summer of 1967, and I went to work in the United States in the summer, picking fruit and doing all sorts of fairly menial jobs. But it was what became known as the Summer of Love, of flower power, the hippie movement, and free love. And when I came back to London, I was a changed person. I came back in caftan with beads and with a beard and long hair. And I'd been propositioned a few times when I was in the States, and I'd sort of been a bit confused as to what to do about it. But when I came back to London, I moved back to London, and I decided it was time to come out. And within a matter of a couple of months, I met my first long-term partner of 24 years, and we lived an openly gay lifestyle, including at work. I trained and I practiced as an architect, and he hated his job, so he wanted to do something different. So we bought a little tea shop and guest house in Rye in Sussex, and we converted it into a fancy restaurant and hotel. And then in 1981, with the same partner, we took over a country pub near Bath. Now, that was very bad timing because it was just the start of the AIDS epidemic. And we came in for a lot of abuse and some violence. Over the next few years, my partner developed a serious drink problem, and he died in the early 1990s at the age of 49. It was such a waste of a life because he was a remarkable and talented man. So I moved back to London and I retrained as a garden designer, and I soon met my current partner. I was living in Pimlico at the time, and the closest gay pub was the Queen's Head, and I was a member of the lesbian and gay windsurfing club, believe it or not. It was a fantastic. It was a fantastic club. It was as much parties and the social side of things as it was actually windsurfing, because being based in London, particularly in the winter months, you don't get much time to do windsurfing, but it was great. And he was just happened to be looking at the notice board, and so I went up and started talking to him. And he wasn't a windsurfer, he was just a bit bored. And I was so excited about meeting him that I didn't tell anybody at all for 6 weeks about it, in case it didn't happen, because I sort of sensed this was somebody that I was really serious about. So really, that's about it. I'm an ambassador. I've been an ambassador for Opening Doors for 3 years, and I'm in a group that's called the Corporate Partnership Group. So we basically go and talk to different corporate firms, particularly their LGBT groups, and see if we can find some common ground, and if we can help them, and if they can help us. Thank you.
So you're very good at asking for money, Richard. Come to that later. Good. All right, no, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. As you can see, everyone, we have a truly awesome panel. Moving quickly on then to some points for discussion. Annie, I wonder whether we can start with you, and you could just expand a little bit more and bring to life a bit more what ODL does, and just share maybe some experiences of its work.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Okay, so Opening Doors London, we support older LGBT people in the capital. And increasingly across the nation with some interesting programs that we've got. Our remit really is around loneliness and isolation. It started about 16 years ago as a project for gay men up in Camden, and grew and grew until we started as our own charity about between 5 and 6 years ago now, which is a very good move. It allowed us to start working across London and develop our services. So to put it in, we have 2,300 members, and to put this in context of where they come from and why we need to be around to support them now and to combat loneliness and isolation. If we think about this group, that very much probably a bit before me, but certainly my age group, certainly Richard's age group, people were living quite often in hidden pockets. It was illegal to be homosexual. It was never, interestingly enough, illegal to be lesbian. The government did try once to actually change that. I think sometime in the 1920s, they tried to change this, but because it was thought at that time that if they started publicizing that lesbians and trying to make it illegal, everybody would want to become lesbians. So it didn't work. So it's never been illegal to be a lesbian. But still, even back in the day, lesbians led very hidden lives. It wasn't acceptable to have a female partner. And in many cases, it was subject to you actually losing your jobs. For the trans community, even more hidden than us. And it's taken a lot longer for the trans community to be able to come together. And to give you some sort of examples of the sort of worlds that people might have lived in back in the day. I mean, you've heard my own personal story of living and having to fight for custody of my own child. And it's happened to a lot of women as they came out, with some fairly disastrous consequences for a lot of them. You know, you'll find a lot of gay men within our members who've lived through the HIV/AIDS epidemic, who were with partners at the time, or, you know, who lived and had their own social networks at the time that were hidden, but they had those contacts, and women, as women, had our own contacts. You might find a trans woman who came out quite late in life amongst our membership, who's had to make major sacrifices in terms of loss of family and friends and jobs. You might find a lesbian. You'll find several in our membership who got thrown out of the military because someone jobbed them in for being a lesbian, with the ensuing loss not only of jobs, but quite at the moment there's quite a big deal about the fact that they lost pensions. And although medals are being restored to people in the military who are thrown out, pensions are not yet, and that is a big issue. Or you might find amongst our membership quite a few men who've been married, who've had heterosexual marriages, who again have gone through the similar to me, and often worse actually for men in terms of the loss of their children, particularly in estrangement. So then times move on, the years move on, with these groups that have found some support, but have sometimes been very isolated, but there have been pockets of support. But as the years gone by and people have lost partners, things have drifted, they found them more isolated from their communities, and that's where Opening Doors comes in. And what we want to do is to be able to help people to form those social networks again, as they get older, that they've got people to see and do stuff with, have relationships with, get married to, you know, and all the stuff that everybody else is allowed to do. And up to COVID, because I'm only going to talk about pre-COVID now, because Richard's going to talk later about what's happened to us in the last year. But up till last year, we were running up to 50 social groups in London, so people were able to come and do anything from playing Scrabble to going to the theatre to being out walking, you know, visiting places. I mean, there was just a whole raft of things going on for people to have fun again, you know.
Hey Annie, how old do you have to be to join this? It sounds good to me.
You have to be 50.
Oh, I've got a
You're
little
not there yet. You're not there yet.
Not quite, no.
No. But, you know, lots of fun. And, you know, there's one thing about our communities, I think, that, you know, we can have a lot of fun. We still know how to party and party hard. So, you know, getting together is really essential for people. So that's been a great success. And people have now got their own social networks. They're seeing each other independently. And that's what we wanted to happen. For our more isolated members, we have a befriending service, and that is for people who can't get out, and volunteers who will visit somebody every week, meet and go and do stuff. And again, that's had to change, but that we will go back to that model as well as something that's more digital. And that there's some really wonderful stories attached to that, of people who've not just physically can't get out because of physical difficulties, but who've got mental health problems and who found themselves very isolated and lost trust really in being part of a community, which is why we've also do some campaigning around health and social care, as Jeff was talking. We have a training offer that's a really good training offer, which goes out to health and social care to help them understand our worlds and understand the issues facing us and our histories, and for them to be able to provide rather better care than quite often has been available to older LGBT plus people in the past within, for instance, residential care or home care. And we have a kite mark, that we can give to people who will go through a certain quite rigorous process to be able to show that they can meet the needs of our members. So those are the sort of three arms of what we do. You know, as we're small, but we're growing. We've doubled our membership in the last 4 years. We've doubled our income. We've about tripled our staff. So we feel as though we're like really a proper organisation now that's going somewhere. We're starting to move into some more work across the country. And again, I think Richard will go into that because that's been facilitated by COVID, which, although it's been devastating, it has provided us with some opportunities.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour through opening doors. I'm very happy to ask more questions about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Annie. That's awesome. As I said, we'll come on to sort of the COVID effect in a bit. But Jeffrey, do you want to add anything to that? Share any your experiences in addition to Annie's of the work of ODL?
I think Annie has said most of what I would have wanted to say, but one of the good things I think about ODL is how it's brought together a lot of the members of the older LGBT community. You know, before COVID, we had a coffee morning every Friday for 2 hours at Tavis House, and it could be between 30 to 40 people who turn up on those mornings. And not only that coffee morning, but ODL published a calendar of monthly events. So it would actually give people things to do throughout an entire month so that people would not feel that isolated. You know, they could join groups, as Annie said, they could go for walks, they could go for visits, maybe to the theater. There was a lunch club at the church in Soho every Thursday where people can go. On the healthcare side, which is really, really important, that some people don't understand the needs or are not familiar with the needs of the older LGBT community within the healthcare system, because a lot of the older LG community have lived at a period, have gone through a period where it was illegal to be gay. And when it comes to healthcare, as I have experienced from my own experience of working in healthcare, they often would not speak up for fear of being treated differently or assume that we'll be treated differently. And one of the things I think ODL on the training side has highlighted the needs of the LGBT community within care homes. And that is really, really important, especially when we play out the scenarios with the staff from the care homes. It has really opened their eyes to some of the mistakes that they were making or could possibly make when it comes to the older LG community. And the response we got from those training courses at the end of the day was very, very positive.
That's fantastic. I mean, and it's very inspiring work. I mean, talking from my own perspective, having watched my mum, who's not old, in a care home environment prematurely because of Alzheimer's, it has made me reflect an awful lot on the assumptions that people make, and on what it might be like selfishly if I found myself in that situation. And you think about that in lots of different ways, but one of the things that you're able to sort of guarantee to some extent, if you're a confident person who's able to articulate what they're thinking and feeling, is that part of your identity. But if you're not able to do that anymore, or you're less able to do that, then it really isn't obvious. And even people do go back to making assumptions. So I think that's just such a powerful thing and such a lovely thing to hear about you doing.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the training side, we do a lot of advocacy.
Yes.
Increasingly a lot of advocacy. We've had people who have had someone come into their home to give them personal care who's been prayed over. We had a woman who we had to advocate for, whose care the care staff came into the house, and one of their duties was to give her a shower, and she wouldn't touch it, because she found out that she was lesbian. And this is just not okay, and it is very frightening for everybody, for us all to think about having to be in that situation.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's another good example of people talk about intersectionality all the time, don't they? And it becomes a bit of a buzzword, but it's real when it comes to things like this. Being an older person and being a member of the LGBT community, you know, those two things can compound each other in terms of negative impacts and things like that. So I think, you know, it's pretty amazing, and it comes back to this point that, you know, I wrote an article for which some people on this call were seeing for Legal Week this week for LGBT History Month, and one of the things I said in that was that I'd done a sort of very unscientific survey of whether people thought that LGBT History Month was actually needed anymore. And the results of my unscientific survey, which was last year, was that a lot of people didn't understand why we would have one. And, you know, the sort of prevailing kind of feeling being, well, we don't have a Straight History Month, so why would we have an LGBT History Month? And I think, you know, this all goes to illustrate just, you know, how important it is to find time like this to hear from people who, you know, we wouldn't necessarily otherwise hear from, and, you know, learn from them.
I mean, in terms of the intersectionality business, you're talking about your mum, which is just such a sad thing. Yeah. We actually do run, one of our activities is that we do run a cafe for people with dementia. It's called the Rainbow Memory Cafe. So you can imagine the additional difficulties of being LGBT and having dementia. Yeah. And for instance, you know, you may be unable to remember recent events, but remember old events, and appear in a care home and think you're still living a straight life.
Yes, exactly.
The complexities are absolutely extraordinary when it comes to this.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit, and I love Jeff's comment as we were going through it about coming out, and you know, this process of coming out is something which, you know, I often talk to people about, and you know, say to people exactly what Jeff said, but with a slightly different complexion, which is that you never stop coming out. You know, you're in the hairdresser's chair and they ask you, you know, what did you do at the weekend, and you've got to make a decision as to whether or not you could be bothered to have that conversation about, you know, about what you really did, or whether actually just rather kind of, you know, not. And I'm just interested to hear, perhaps starting with Richard, whether, you know, you've got any more any more observations about that sort of ongoing process, and in particular around coming out in the context of being an older person.
I think, well, as I mentioned, I came out in 1967, and we were openly gay, and we had a little flat in Islington with a double bed, and our parents came and they saw it and they didn't make any comment at all. And about 4 or 5 years later, my father died. And one of the first things my mother said afterwards, she said, "It's a good job he died before he found out what you were." And I was so angry and horrified by this. And I knew my dad very well. He was a very liberal sort of person. It didn't bother him at all. What this was my mother was projecting her dislike of the situation onto him, and I realised that straight away. But yeah, I mean, it's after over the years, because she lived for quite a lot longer than my father, she had to come to terms with it. So, you know, yeah, it was okay. She was tolerant about it. I don't think she ever really embraced it, but she became tolerant of it.
And Millie, what's it like now? I mean, obviously you can't talk to everyone, but probably through your work with JLU, you've got a bit of a better idea about, you know, sort of different people's experiences. What's it like now for younger people with this, but in an age of, you know, social media and everything else?
Yeah, I think social media is really amazing because it just gives people such easier access to see you know, people of such different identities, which people just didn't have before. I mean, I was in school kind of about 10 years ago, and there was kind of no mention for me. I was at a Catholic school as well, but I had friends who were at non-religious schools, and with, you know, each of them, there was just no mention of kind of LGBTQ plus people at all, apart from as, you know, in like a negative way. So for me, it was kind of, yeah, it was quite difficult, and it felt quite isolating at the time. But I think now, and particularly through Just Like Us, I see that there are schools that they create pride groups or societies, and they have people like us coming in and just talking about it really openly. And I feel like, yeah, alongside the social media and things like that, it is definitely, I do see that progress. And yeah, I think it's definitely getting better, but then also saying that I think it is really dependent on other kind of intersectionalities, like, you know, depending on your background, whether that's your ethnicity or your class as well, it might be different again, and also your identity itself. Like, for example, as a gay woman, I've been very lucky, and I'm also, you know, I'm a white cisgender gay woman, and I've been very lucky that I haven't experienced much kind of overt discrimination, but then there are kind of other issues that come alongside that. But yeah, I think it does really depend, because whereas if there's someone who identifies as transgender, for example, they might have a very different experience. But I think it's definitely, there is a lot to be hopeful about and a lot to be positive about. And I see that at Just Like Us all the time. Whenever I give talks, we always receive really lovely feedback. And that's so amazing to see. Like, if we just help one young LGBT plus person, it just makes it all worth it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think one of the nice things about, you know, that we've been trying to make sure of in this month is that, you know, we do share these kind of positive stories, as well as not becoming complacent and thinking that, you know, everything's okay, because it isn't. I mean, which I think maybe brings us on to COVID, because COVID is a real example of, I think, massive pluses and massive minuses in the LGBT community. Just Like Us published some research just a few days ago. It was the first big scale research on mental health of young people during COVID. And when I got the slide pack summarising the research from Dominic Arnold, who's our CEO, who's dialed in here, he sent it to me and another trustee before it was before it went anywhere else. And I opened it and just, you know, kind of pretty devastated really with what it said, because the finding was that young LGBT people were twice as likely to worry about their mental health and to be lonely in this time than their non-LGBT peers, which, you know, really is a very striking statistic. And if you then break it down in, you know, further, and you look at some of those intersections which we've talked about, you know, the research is even more troubling in some of those areas. So, I mean, we have to balance all these things, but all we can really do is try and, I think, support initiatives like the ones we're talking about today, and try and make the most of it. We were talking before the call about how COVID had affected charities operationally, and made the observation that couldn't be more proud of the team at Just Like Us, both the staff team and all our volunteers, because what's happened through COVID is actually we've managed to expand our operations. We haven't had to furlough anyone, and we have been able to reach a lot more people, a lot more young people, around 2 million young people during our last School Diversity Week, which was done online in the summer. And I think that, you know, when you contrast that to some other charities which have had a really terribly tough time, then, you know, there's a lot of hope there. Albeit, you know, we can't wait to get back on the ground as well and do some of the things we were doing before. And Richard, I know you were going to share sort of your, you know, parallel kind of experiences with ODL on the sort of COVID effect.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as Annie mentioned, ODL's mission is to ensure that older LGBT people live happy and healthy lives. And although our main emphasis is on loneliness and isolation, we recognise that there's other issues that need addressing. And so we respond to members' needs by putting them in touch with social services, with housing and benefits, particularly in the pandemic, even food shortages and medical aid. These have been really important things, particularly for the older, more frail people who are living alone and can't get out. We commissioned a report in the first few months of the pandemic, and there are a lot of findings that are representative of the population at large, but some are quite starkly different. This is partly due to the fact that we mentioned earlier that older LGBT people often don't have the support of children or close family members. For me, the most shocking statistics were that 27% of members hardly ever or never talk to somebody else. I found that absolutely shocking. 23% experiencing worse physical health during lockdown, 18% were more depressed. And another thing I found that I hadn't really thought about before was that 20% of our members are digitally excluded, which I'll come back to later. Now, the befriending service, previously it was all face-to-face, and obviously we needed to move the whole thing over to tele-befriending. And since the start of the pandemic, we've recruited another 80 volunteers, and they contact our members every week. And the good news is that we now reach vulnerable people outside London, which account for 20% of the service. And also there's been a much larger uptake in the BAME community. And that's sort of an interesting thing that we weren't expecting. The online groups, the pandemic has meant that all the groups we run and the activities have had to be suspended. And we can move some of those groups over to Zoom. And the specialist groups, such as the Dementia Cafe and the BAME group, they've been facilitated special access. ODL, I think, over the next few months will become a national charity rather than just a London-based charity. As Ali mentioned, we've been growing very fast, and increasingly we're asked for training and consultancy outside London. And so we're currently advising on setting up LGBTQ plus tele-befriending service in Leicester. Jeff mentioned about the online training, and we've currently got 30 care homes who are going through this accreditation process, which is called Pride in Care. And the great thing is that the care home can put up a rainbow sticker with the Pride in Care thing on, so that older LGBT people know if there's problems raised, that they know the management will look upon it sympathetically. The way this is done at the moment is that all the training of the management and staff is done on Zoom, and there's also online tours of the premises on Zoom as well. But frail and elderly LGBT people in care homes tend to go back into the closet, and the reason for this is that largely is that they fear the homophobia of the other elderly residents, because this is the most homophobic group in society. And we need the staff to professionally address this problem and understand the particular needs of the LGBT community. And as Jeffrey mentioned, we also do online training for health and care groups, which can be purchased as training modules. The digital exclusion was, I think, perhaps one of the most surprising things for me that came from the research, because it's not just a question of laptops and online. it's also smartphone and smart TV. And if you take these three things together, it really impacts the quality of the life of the older people. They don't, if they just have terrestrial channels, and if they don't have a smartphone, then their lives are so limited. At the start of the pandemic, we put out a call to our corporate partners for iPads, and we had a really good response. And this helped address people who didn't have laptops, but of course it doesn't address the training issue of the digital exclusion. And I think this is something we will have to address very seriously over the next few months and the coming year.
Thank you, Richard. That's fantastic. And again, really great to have some of these points brought to life. Perhaps because I work with pension funds, I have had a number of conversations with some of my friends, some of my LGBT friends, about what we're going to do when we get older, and the idea of going into some of these care homes didn't strike us as particularly attractive, and we concluded we'd have to create our own version of that hotel in India that featured in the film. We'd all club together and buy a little share and something. But I think your model sounds a little bit more realistic.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I have an aunt who's a lesbian head teacher, and they bought a big house in Blackheath with about 5 or 6 other lesbian teachers.
Yeah.
And they each had a little self-contained flat, and they met for dinner on a Friday night, and they divided the tasks up. Yeah. So my aunt, she did the gardening, and somebody did the shopping for her. So I think it can work.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be. While people are still able, there are solutions.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to open this up to questions now. I mean, clearly, if panelists have got questions for other panelists, then that would be great. But even better would be if we heard from people in the virtual room. So put your hand up if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question using Teams, or do put something in the chat function if you would prefer to do it like that. Who's going to start us off? It's not like this group of people to be quiet.
Hi, it's Chris here, Chris Edwards.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
And actually, I'm on camera. Let me turn off.
No, stay.
It's a question about language, actually, and sort of the evolving nature of language, and it's one which we've touched on at the firm, and I think there is sort of an intergenerational angle to this. It's the use of the word queer. So when we look at the LGBTQ community, for a lot of LGBT people, including me, actually, the word queer sort of brings back pretty negative memories, and it has very, very negative connotations. So I'm just sort of wondering what your views are, perhaps, on not only the word queer, but sort of the evolving nature of language.
Well, could I just say something? I suppose it was about 6-7 months ago. I went to see an old friend of mine. She's in her 80s. She's not LGBTQ, but we got talking about it, and she said, "Well, I understand what LGBT is, but what does Q plus mean?" And I really struggled to explain it. And she said, "Surely there must be a simpler way of talking about this." And so I came to the conclusion that rather than keep adding more and more letters onto LGBT, we should just call ourselves queer and be done with it. And I'm from a generation where queer was a huge term of abuse. So I've come around to the conclusion that's what we should do.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think, obviously when I was at school, the word queer wasn't used as much as a slur as I think it used to be. But I try to use the word now, and I just really like the way it's so ambiguous, because it's kind of like, in using that word, it's like you know, you don't know my sexual orientation or my gender identity, and it's kind of saying like, does it even really matter? It's just like an all-encompassing word. Absolutely. And I really like it. I really like using it.
Yeah, I also like using it, Millie. I'm a bit on Richard's side here, but it's very controversial amongst our older members because of its connotations going back, and we have to be extremely sensitive to that. You know, things have come along so, you know, young people can now have the choice of not identifying as anything in particular and just being themselves, which is wonderful. But, you know, back in the day, you know, my first partner, and I know that Chris has been waiting for me to tell this story, my first partner was very much of the butch and femme binary, yeah, amongst lesbians. She was extremely butch, and I wasn't particularly femme, to tell you the truth, but she would have quite liked me to be a bit more femme. And and she, and again, this happened now because people can be however they want. She was a stone butch. Do you know what a stone butch is, Millie? I think you do. No, okay. Well, but everybody out there, I don't want to shock you too much. This is of a sexual nature. But a stone butch was a very butch woman who, when lovemaking, would do, but she wouldn't be done to. Yeah. So no, you know, way back from that physical intimacy thing for these women. And then I never hear about that now. You know, people can just decide to do or be whoever they are, which I think is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, you're amazing, Annie. Jeffrey, you got any thoughts?
I don't know where I stand with the word queer. I've never really given it much thought, if I'm honest with you. But I always remember, whenever I hear the word queer, it makes me laugh. Because when I was working as a nurse, when patients were ill, they would always say, oh, I do feel a bit queer. Yeah. I suspect people do say that, even in this day and age. If they're not going to say, oh my God, I do feel a bit queer today. And I says, really?
No, it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, like I sort of feel like Chris a bit about it. I find it a really uncomfortable word. Not just for me, and I know that's because of school. You know, and I am very conscious through what JLU does that, you know, the schools of now, whilst they're not perfect, are just so different to where you know, when I was at school. But it was absolutely a, you know, big term of abuse, and it still very much has those connotations. All that said, I absolutely get the point, and you know, it is much less of a mouthful, isn't it? I work with quite a lot of older people on some of my pension schemes, and the number of times that that one of them talks about making sure we don't queer the pitch with absolutely no self-awareness whatsoever that there are some people might, this might be a loaded term, always amazes me. Not that I have a problem particularly with it. I wouldn't understand the sports analogy anyway, but there we are. We've got a question from Dominic, who is, I think this is Dominic Arnold, who's the chief executive of Just Like Us. He says, to the more senior members of the LGBT plus community on the line, how can we make sure we learn the lessons of the way LGBT people were treated in the 80s and 90s and not repeat history with how we're treating trans people today?
So this is a question about how we make sure that trans people are included, yeah, in our worlds. You know, this is, you know, for me, this is very close to my heart with our work with Opening Doors. I come from a feminist background, but I don't come from a trans exclusionary feminist background. And I am not happy at all with the approach of groups of women who come from these feminist backgrounds who are trans exclusionary. I find it absolutely horrendous. You know, we choose our gender, and you know, if people decide they want to be women, they're women. You know, and if they would decide they want to be men, they're men, and that's it. So I think we need to have a voice. As Opening Doors London, you know, we have our own trans group. We have members of staff. We're very inclusive, and we put out that message all the time, because this is a group that is one of the most excluded groups, and faces phenomenal difficulties. I mean, when we were carers for the Albert Kennedy Trust, we had young trans people living with us, and they were the most unhappy young people I've come across, facing the most complex stuff, much more likely to have mental health problems. And as a teenager, to have to come to terms with all that and go through all that, with your family, with your school, with your friends, with the world, I think it's probably one of the most difficult things. We just have to be out there supporting the trans community, getting stuck in, volunteering, contributing to their charities, you know, anything that, talking to people about it.
Jeffrey or Richard, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I think we have, over the last 20 or so years ago, the LGBT community has made huge strides forward. But I think the trans group have got left behind to a large extent. And, you know, I think in a way we have an obligation to them to achieve the same sort of equality and quality of life, and the happiness and chance to be fulfilled that has been given to us. So I think we have a moral obligation to them, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, I do agree with what Richard have just said. I was also going to make that statement, so I entirely agree with what he has just said.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we have got a couple more questions, but I think we're going to have to wrap up now, because I know we said we'd try and finish around 1:30. I know some people have got to go to other things. For people, particularly for people within Travers Smith, obviously, I hope you're aware of our LGBT plus group, which has been going for a long time now, and which is, you know, sponsored this session, and as I said at the beginning, is where the idea came from. That's absolutely open to LGBT plus people and non-LGBT plus people, and it's a great group. So do consider getting involved if you'd like to. We're all very friendly, and you know, we like having new people and new ideas. Likewise, if you have been inspired by the stories that have been shared today, do have a look at the ODL website and the GLU website as well. And those websites feature ways in which you can support the work of those charities, both in terms of volunteering and potentially if you want to do a bake sale or run a marathon or whatever else we're allowed to do when things open up. So thanks ever so much, everyone. Thank you for having such a wonderful panel. It's been an enormous pleasure doing this with you and preparing for it over the last few days. So thank you very sincerely and for taking the time.
Oh, by the way, Daniel, before you go, what's your website address?
Which one? The JLU one?
Yeah,
or the Travers Smith one?
The Travers one.
It's traverssmith.com.
Traverssmith.com. Traverssmith.com.
Yeah.
Okay, then.
Okay, thanks so many people for attending as well. It's really great to see you all, and for those watching this on the video, then I hope you've enjoyed it too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.